Hey everyone, thanks for your time. Happy Independence Day here in the US. It's the 250th. If you have any questions, when you get to that point, or if you feel like you have any questions, go ahead and at me in chat at Philip Sloss, Philip with one L. I thought I would just go through. I thought I would go through some of the status right now. Again, Artemis. Making the distinction which we're seeing NASA make between Artemis and Moonbase. They've just reorganized. Again, I don't know that we've heard the status of congressional approval, but they've certainly moved the gears in that direction, going from two separate directorates for the ISS Space Operations Mission Directorate and the Artemis things before, which was Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate. Now there's going to be just a Human Spaceflight Mission Directorate, and then underneath that is going to be a Low Earth Orbit, which is ISS, Artemis, which is what I'm still concentrating on, and then also Moonbase, obviously. But we're probably going to see more distinctions between Artemis and Moonbase in terms of the quote unquote beyond Earth orbit exploration as we go. And so here's where we are kind of on the calendar, beginning of the second half of 2026, beginning of the third quarter of 2026. And there are a few deadlines. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are a few goalposts, I guess, that have been sort of staked out for the end of the year. And we can get to that. They're not, I guess, directly in the Artemis critical path, so to speak. But these are where the Artemis missions would lay out on the calendar for the rest of this more or less presidential term. I'm missing 3 weeks in January 2029 before this presidential term ends. We had Artemis 2 at the beginning of the last quarter. They're hoping to fly Artemis 3 in the middle of next year, but we've heard some different guesstimates, I guess. Artemis 4 is, depending on your source, a similar thing where there's not a lot of certainty about the date. It was early 2028. We've also seen a reference refer to it as no later than March 2028, which is what I'm showing here. And then we don't really have any updates on Artemis 5 beyond what we heard in late February when the manifest was adjusted. So Artemis 5 is still tentatively late 2028. Whoop. Different mouse. So where we are kind of, and I say we, I shouldn't say we, it's where NASA is, generally speaking, and NASA and friends. So you have all of the different commercial companies. Some of them are contractors, I guess you could refer to them, for the government pays the whole way, quote unquote, cost plus contracts. And then you also have the private developers, the commercial companies, even though they're all commercial companies, but you have the human landing system, lunar landers, and the lunar surface spacesuit. Those are private products being developed by industry, and then NASA will rent like a rental car kind of a thing. Although it's not a perfect analogy since NASA is involved in the development, but these products will be owned by the developers, SpaceX, Axiom Space, Blue Origin, and so on. So in terms of where things are right now, we have the most information about Artemis 3, most up-to-date information. That doesn't necessarily mean there are less questions. We haven't got as many updates about Artemis 4 and 5 in the last 4 months. It's about 4 months since the manifest was updated. So again, that updated manifest, Artemis 3 is a low Earth orbit mission that NASA wants to dock with a prototype of both of the lunar landers. Artemis 4 is now the goal that NASA has had for the entire decade, which is to land the next astronauts on the moon. So it used to be Artemis 3 was the first Artemis lunar landing, the next U.S. lunar landing. Now it's Artemis 4, and then Artemis 5 would be another lunar landing late 2028. But again, we haven't really heard any updates on that in the last 4 months. So, and I'll go through just a little bit of sort of a big picture where we are with that. So for Artemis 3, we have heard a little bit more. So I believe NASA Administrator Jarrett Isaacman mentioned it in the Moonbase update this last week. Again, sort of not rhetorical, but sort of euphemistically. I don't know if he's referring to an actual internal checkpoint that they did to say that they're go for stacking, but that would be stacking the aft assemblies of the SLS solid rocket boosters on Mobile Launcher 1 in the vehicle assembly building at Kennedy Space Center. And so for that to start, the aft assemblies would need to be ready. Those are being staged in the rotation processing and surge facility. And then Mobile Launcher 1 is already in High Bay 3 in the VAB, and they were doing there was still some work that we heard about a month ago when the Artemis 3 crew was announced, but they were talking about those being ready to go this month. And we will see when those aft assemblies, they'll roll from the rotation building, which is, basically a block away from the vehicle assembly building. They would roll into, and we'll have to see whether they roll into the transfer aisle to be lifted up onto the mobile launcher, or whether they roll into High Bay 4. The transfer aisle has looked kind of cluttered in the last pictures we've seen of it, but that's neither here nor there. Just again, for those of you who like severe trivia like myself, at least for this type of stuff anyway, the Artemis 1 solid rocket boosters were staged in High Bay 4, and then they were lifted up into High Bay 3 from there. Artemis 2 pretty much, I think completely, were staged in the transfer aisle. So they're offloading motor segments, the two aft segments that were then integrated with other hardware at Kennedy arrived in Florida in April. The rest of them just arrived in this last several weeks. They're being offloaded from the rail cars. We saw a picture or a couple of pictures of one of the forward segments being offloaded. I believe it was the left-hand forward segment. And so they're going through that process. Those segments will be either held or stored, or I guess it depends on your terminology, but those will basically wait until their turn in stacking, whether they stay in the rotation building or they go to one of the surge buildings. Probably surge 2 is, again, sort of severe trivia, but that's a little farther down the road. The two of the RS-25 engines we've seen pictures of in the engine servicing area, which is also in the vehicle assembly building. That's managed by RS-25 prime contractor L3Harris. We don't have an installation schedule. What was interesting, though, again, in terms of trying to read tea leaves, is that the first engine that was shipped to Kennedy was, in theory, the last engine that would be installed. And so, again, in my interpretation of that, or, well, that's not a good way of putting it. One interpretation of that would be that they expect all 4 engines to arrive from Stennis. They'll get them set up in the engine servicing area, and I can run through that. NASA released a time-lapse video from a couple of weeks back of one of the engines, and this is a different time-lapse. So the short of it is that, well, let me stop here. Let me go back and see if you can see the engines. They're shipped horizontally. There's a canister that goes over this, and then the engines are, they're broken over from horizontal to vertical. This, I believe, was the first engine. This would have been engine 2052. It would go into the engine. It would go into the number 4 position in the core stage. And so what this essentially would put them in a position, this is just another view of that. This would put them, stage them basically to roll across the transfer aisle into high bay 2. Then they would be, then another crane and lift fixture would install them on the EVI, the engine vertical installer, and then that would install the engines in the core stage. But we don't know when that's going to happen, so I'll come back to that in a little bit. We haven't heard as much about Orion production for Artemis 3. The last we heard was about a month ago. It was mentioned that the heat shield was ready to be installed, basically stacked with the core stage, mated to the core stage, so the crew module of Orion. But we haven't. I was just asking last week if there's any update or pictures of that. Have not heard any update on that. So we have the last thing we saw was let me see if I can find that picture. So the last we saw was this picture. This is 2 months old now, May 12th, technically. This is the service module. Service module is essentially fully assembled and has gone through all of the major testing. This was being set up for the final major standalone integrated test, which was the direct field acoustic test. Those are those speakers, those big black speakers around it. This is before the test. NASA Public Affairs confirmed that test is already completed, and so now it's I don't know whether it's waiting just on the side here or whether it would go into there's a stacking cell for a better. It's called the final assembly systems test cell, and the service module would go in there first, and then when the crew module is ready, which is a long ways away, relatively speaking, because they still have work to do. When the crew module is ready, it would be taken over and lifted into that cell and attached to the crew module adapter, which is the top piece of the service module. And so then, generally speaking, we have little bits and pieces, but we're, as usual, just generally speaking, updates are sort of there. There's the news feed in terms of details, status, schedule is very sparse. We get pictures, and then we basically typically we have to interpret. We have to fill in with context, either from the pictures or the dates, or a little bit of both. So again, this is just kind of looking at Artemis 3, again, sort of hardware. The boosters, they're getting ready to start booster stacking. That would begin with the aft assemblies, and then they would, again, the order of the way that they would stack the rest of the motor segments on top of them is, to be determined. They could go, left, right, or they could alternate from the left-hand booster to the right-hand booster, or they could stack the entire left-hand booster. I think we've seen them typically going back and forth between the left hand and the right hand. Does not make that, I don't know that it makes that much of a difference one way or the other. It's not probably critical path for anything this year or the launch itself. And so exploration ground systems with major assistance from Northrop Grumman, the prime contractor, and of course the prime contractor for the ground processing there, which is Amentum. They're the ones that are doing the the booster stacking in the vehicle assembly building. For the SLS program, probably the critical path for this tanking test that they're talking about at the end of the year is finishing the core stage. So the booster production of the boosters was completed 4 years ago, basically, for the Artemis 3 segments. And as I've mentioned, if you've seen some of these, the Artemis 4 boosters are ready right now as well. Have to get to them later, but those were finished probably last year, if not 2024. And they're working on the boosters for Artemis 5, Northrop Grumman. That's in Utah. So out of all of the hardware for Artemis 3 from an SLS standpoint, the piece that's not done, and I'll set aside the spacer for a second, is the core stage. All of the elements have been mated. They're getting it ready for engine install. And then after engine install, then they would, again, depending on whether they have all the parts for the stage so that it can be fully assembled, they would go into maybe phases or pieces of the final integrated functional test. And then in theory, they wouldn't be able to complete all of that until the stage is whole. All of the parts are installed. When they complete the FIFT, the stage would more or less be ready to either you'd call that complete and be ready to hand over to EGS for stacking, or there may be some, since it's in the same building where it's going to be stacked to the boosters, there may be some schedule optimization there depending on when that occurs. We're waiting to hear kind of when I guess probably what's going to end up happening is, like a lot of this stuff, and not just NASA, not just SLS, but we'll find out after it happens. We'll find out when it's supposed to happen after it happens. But those are sort of the two big milestones. And the stage, as far as we know, they're still working on it, still trying to get, still trying to ask some questions if I can in the certainly during the summer. And then, as I mentioned, down the road, the idea is that they would stack the boosters, mate the core stage when it's done, and then they would close out those hardware elements for going outside. Stick the weather cover on there that I talked about in a recent video. That may or may not be topped out by the lift spider, but roll out to the pad, do a tanking test or two, and then come back. There may be some other things. I would sort of tend to generalize a rollout and rollback as a campaign. So a tanking test campaign. So we may see some other things like the contingency pad access platforms. They weren't able to completely do the full certification. Doesn't mean they can't use them, but they wanted to run through the entire sequence of installing them. I don't know whether they would actually try and gain access inside the forward assemblies of the boosters and the core stage intertank, considering that they're going to have a lot of time, maybe. But do that, install those platforms, whatever else they need to do for verification and validation of those, remove them. And then again, depending on how they would do that relative to tanking tests, do those, any other pad work they want to do, any other validations, any other testing they want to do, and then roll the vehicle back to complete stacking of the rest of the elements. Pardon me, that include the launch vehicle stage adapter, then the spacer, then the Orion stage adapter, pardon me again, and then typically what they've done, and even though this is only a third time through, is they have, and maybe it will be different, but what they did last time and the time before was they would wait until Orion was nearly ready to stack before they would lift the Orion stage adapter on top of SLS. Depends. In that case, it's possible that they were holding that because there were CubeSats on it. There is, I guess, an open request for CubeSats. Again, you have to wonder, given there are other possibilities or availabilities to get rides into low Earth orbit. This is probably opportunities for folks that can't afford to buy a ticket, I guess, because they'll have to wait for this launch opportunity. So, and then for the rest of Artemis 3, at least what we know, Starship, we are waiting for the Artemis tech demonstrations, but those will be after the more critical foundational testing that they're doing on the ship and the booster. They're getting ready to do the second flight test of version 3, and again the focus there is on going from suborbital recovery tests to orbital recovery, full recovery of the hardware, and then going from recovery to reusability, and then going from reusability to rapid reusability. Where the Artemis tech demos fall in that sequence is not public. So we'll have to see. And to be fair, I don't know that they even need to do the propellant transfer demo, for instance, to support Artemis 3. That will be important for Artemis 4, or whenever they go. That'll be important for them to go anywhere beyond Earth orbit. So that's Starship, Blue Moon HLS. We saw renders of a Mark II demonstrator last month, but we don't have... I don't know that we've seen hardware. They talked about hardware being in production for that. Not quite the same thing as the Mark I cargo lander. And then obviously there's another elephant in the room, which is the New Glenn return to flight. We've seen some progress reported on rebuilding. It's not going to just be a pure pad rebuild for Launch Complex 36, but they're reporting progress again in hindsight, but we're not getting any context, and so we don't know. We have their goal, which is to be flying again by the end of the year, and we have progress. We have some progress, I guess, but we don't have any context. So again, we don't really know. It would be impossible, given the information we have, to say whether they're ahead of schedule, on schedule, or behind schedule, because we don't have a schedule. So, and then for the lunar surface spacesuits, we got kind of clarity on what they're planning to do for Artemis 3, which is they're going to fly, I guess, some kind of an engineering test unit, but it's not necessarily going to be functional, and they aren't going to demonstrate functionality of the suit on Artemis 3. The idea would be that it would be launched on the Blue Moon demonstrator, since the crew's going to the flight plan is to dock and ingress the Blue Moon prototype, and then if they have time and if it's available, this prototype is available, they could do as much as essentially donning and doffing, putting on the suit, taking it off. Again, we don't have that level of detail about the demonstrator, the Mark II demonstrator, whether how high a fidelity of an airlock they would have. It might not necessarily need to be any higher fidelity than what we saw with some integration tests that were done a couple of years ago with a unknown level of fidelity airlock and demonstration suits from Axiom. So again, if you're just looking for clearances and things like that, you might just need to have the dimensions of the airlock and the positioning at least something that you can evaluate on orbit. So that's Artemis 3. Artemis 4 and 5, it gets a little bit, it gets a little thinner. So one thing that's become clearer, because Artemis 3 is being defined in terms of the risk that they can buy down within the time frame that they're looking at. So it still seems like the flying the mission next year is a higher priority than waiting for more functionality for those prototypes in a low Earth orbit scenario. And what that means is then for the ultimate goal of landing on the moon with people again, all of the tech demos that they need to do besides Artemis 3 are critical to being ready to fly the lunar landing mission. And so for Starship, again, that's the propellant transfer demo, then their uncrewed lunar landing demo. And then for Blue Moon, it would be only, in quotes, an uncrewed lunar landing demo. But that's going to be critical for both of these, which is the ability to get the spacecraft first, the ability to get the spacecraft to the moon into a lunar orbit, get it set up for powered descent, demonstrate powered descent and landing, and then however much of a surface stay they're going to demonstrate, that's not clear. And then how much of a lunar ascent they're going to demonstrate, which is also not clear. I guess it's a little clearer for Starship because they're only talking about doing a hop, basically. So basically, again, we're missing a lot of information, a lot of context about what's going on there. So again, we don't know whether they're ahead of schedule for first quarter of 2028, on schedule, behind schedule, because we don't have a schedule. For Orion, there's not a lot of new information. So we know that the service module elements have been mated, the crew module adapter and the European service module. The crew module is being outfitted. So we know that it's in production, in assembly, but we really don't have any sense. Similarly to HLS, we don't know whether they're, again, ahead of schedule, on schedule, behind schedule, because we don't have the schedule for that. For SLS, the heritage hardware is ready. So again, I mentioned that the Artemis 4 boosters, the motors, are in storage in Utah. The 4 RS-25 engines, which are shuttle heritage, are in storage at Stennis Space Center. And then if they're going to use ICPS, which all indications are that they're going to use ICPS, but have not got that confirmed. I was kind of hoping to just get just an official, yes, we're going to do that. What I got back was we're not ready to say anything yet, but it's there, it's available. If they were going to fly this Block 1 configuration again for a fourth time, those are essentially all ready to converge on Kennedy Space Center for stacking. But what SLS is missing is basically everything else. So there is no fourth launch vehicle stage adapter or fourth Orion stage adapter. I'm asking about those because those are blatantly obvious. They're going to need something if they're going to fly ICPS, or even if they were just going to fly another spacer, they would need to build. So we don't know whether they're going to buy another LVSA or build it. For the Orion stage adapter, that's a little bit more of an academic exercise, since that's what NASA has built that in-house, but we don't have a status or schedule for either procurement for LVSA or for manufacturing and assembly for either of them. For the core stage, we have seen pictures. Again, we just saw this video of the liquid oxygen tank. So this is actually almost a month ago, mid-June. So it was the last structural element to be completed. So this is showing the fully welded, and fully, I guess, is air quotes, but the major welds are the the domes and the barrels, and then those are welded together, friction stir welded into a liquid oxygen tank. There is one piece of sort of cleanup, which is plug welds. And so just a quick, so what they did is they moved it out of the vertical assembly building 110 at Machute Assembly Facility in New Orleans. And they moved it over. They put it on a straddle carrier, which you're looking at here. And then it's rolled into area 6. You can see that door open there. And then they put it on tank rats, which are basically tools that they use at MAF for the tanks at this point in production. So if we look at, and I'm going to hide myself for a minute here, or try to, there we go. So this is an old graphic, but it's still somewhat applicable. So for core stage 4, which would fly on Artemis 4, the forward skirt would be here in TPS applications. So we just saw, I just was looking at the video. So they finished VAC welding. So then the next thing is it's not exactly hydrostatic proof, because they would need to do a few other things like plug welds. You wouldn't proof test it until it was pressure tight. But that would be the next step for the LOX tank. The inner tank is also in TPS applications. The LH2 tank should be in it's either in pneumatic proof or it was headed in that direction. Again, these are the types of things that I would be interested in asking about on a more regular basis. And so we're always trying to find opportunities to ask. The engine section is at Kennedy Space Center, and there's, I think, a picture I can show you of that. That's in integration. There is a boat tail. I believe it is still in New Orleans. So that's where that element is. And then for the lunar surface spacesuits, that's again kind of cloudy. They talked recently in an interview with Payload Space. They didn't talk about the next programmatic milestone, which is critical design review, which is led or preceded by a crewed vacuum test. And so they didn't talk about those tests. I think they may have mentioned CDR, but they did not mention a time frame. So again, no status, no schedule. The one they did mention a qual unit that they're talking about having done in the Thanksgiving timeframe, November, December. But they did not necessarily contextualize that. Is that qual unit what they would use for the vacuum test? Is that critical path for critical design review? So that's not totally clear, but those are the types of things that will kind of have or watch items basically for Artemis 4. For Artemis 5, I think at this point the question, there's probably broader questions, but just focusing on, I don't think I had anything else. Nope. So I don't know that there's going to be as much. It would be, I guess, similar between Artemis 4 and 5 for Orion and SLS and exploration ground systems. There's a little bit of development in here because of the upper stage question, but similarly for HLS and for the spacesuits, there would be some feedback from Artemis 4 that they would want if they needed to make any tweaks to the spacesuits. For the landers, I guess it's a little bit more of a question because it's possible that whichever provider flies Artemis 4, they might give the other provider Artemis 5. Again, it depends on whether the other provider is ready. So there's a little bit of a question there. But so setting that aside, For Orion, we know that Airbus is integrating ESM5 in Germany. I don't know that we've gotten a status on that recently, but they're the ones probably closest to this annual cadence that has become a bigger deal in the last 6 months or so since the new administration came in with Mr. Isaacman. The crew module structure is in Florida. The crew module adapter structure, I believe, although I don't know that we've seen the crew module adapter for 5, but that hardware is in process in the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building at Kennedy Space Center. But again, we don't really have. I don't know that I think we've seen the crew module structure, but I don't know that we've seen it recently. I don't think we've seen the crew module adapter structure recently. And again, no status, no schedule. For SLS, the boosters are still shuttle heritage. Those are in production. As I said, we saw the cases. It's now almost exactly a year ago in Utah. They were waiting for a thumbs up to start casting propellant in those. So they could be upwards of a year or so into that process. So those will be ready. Those will be ready probably in the next year or so, and then they'll just go into storage. For the engines, these will be the new production restart builds, and L3 Harris has already finished the first 2 engines and are basically lining up as many as engines out through. They're building engines for Artemis all the way out to Artemis 9. So it's really just a question of they need to integrate the engines and then do an acceptance test. So the first 2 engines, 20,001, 20,002, have already been acceptance tested, and those are just going to go into storage at Stennis with the shuttle heritage ones, and now they need to finish 20,003, 4, 5. In theory, you would want to have the first 8 of those ready so that you would have a full set of spares. And they will need to have the first set of 4 ready to back up Artemis 4, just in case. And we just saw that with Artemis 2, where they swapped out one of the engines that was installed on the core stage with what was then an Artemis 3 engine. And they did a little bit of a, volleyball team rotation kind of a thing. But those are in production. We don't have hard status or schedule on those, but we have at least a little bit of recent status on those. For the upper stage, we know what they want to do with the Centaur 5. We did see one of the members of the channel noted that Boeing presented a paper 2 months ago at an AIAA meeting in Washington, D.C. So there was actually some really interesting information in there about the stage. You hear whispers about structural capability with the stage because it was not designed to fly on SLS. But big picture, it's not under Centaur 5 on SLS is not under contract yet. We're waiting for an update from NASA on Centaur 5 in air quotes. So we don't know whether they're going to give us information about procurement, about technical integration or status or schedule. But right now there is no upper stage for SLS beyond Artemis 4. And similar, so there's nothing under contract. I think Target, back when they released the sole source justification, was October. I don't know whether that's contingent on having a budget or just having a continuing resolution. I guess we will see. And then similarly for the Artemis 5 SLS, we don't know if the 5th, I put a video out about this. because of the way that the contracts were lined up for core stage production, NASA only bought a full set of parts and full labor to build the fourth one. And so we don't know whether there's a full set of parts and whether all of the labor is under contract for core stage 5 at this point. So the what they have is they have the long leads, which is important. And in fact, Boeing was contracted. That contract was finalized at the time of Artemis 1. So this is going back 3.5. Yeah, a little bit more than 3.5 years to buy long leads out farther than that. And so we are hearing about structures for a sixth stage, for instance. But, so those long leads are important because if you want to catch up, it's hard to catch up if you don't have all the long leads. But there's a difference between being generally positioned to build stages and then actually finishing them. And so we're probably no more than, or they only have 2 years basically to finish that stage. And we don't know whether they're contracted to finish that stage. So let me just go ahead, and there's a few other things here. So again, we really don't have a lot of, we're waiting to hear about solid rocket booster stacking for Artemis 3 this month. We have gotten a few hints that's not about on schedule, but that it's tracking for this time frame for this month. But then beyond that, things are a little bit hazier. So again, I mentioned the Axiom EMU crude vacuum test that would have to occur in order to complete the critical design review for that. So we don't know when that's going to happen. The Starship propellant transfer demo, SpaceX just a month ago said they're still planning on doing it this year. So we'll be waiting for that. And then similarly, it isn't like the Starship HLS design is totally hinging on the propellant transfer demo. There are important parts of that, but what is contingent on that, similarly to the Axiom spacesuits, is completing that critical design review. So there's an overarching sort of agency level, program level, final meeting where they sign off formally. Now, again, since it's Starship and it's a different type of a development model, probably different than your typical NASA program and NASA program life cycle. But that was something that they changed in the last 4 years or so, was they made completing the HLS critical design review contingent on the propellant transfer demonstration. So we're waiting for those. We don't know exactly where those would be this year, but those are still, there is still some expectation that those will be this year. And then similarly, we heard in the last few months that from Lockheed Martin, in fact, I think it was at that Ascend conference in mid-May in Washington, D.C., that they're still looking at trying to finish the Artemis 3 Orion by the end of this year, early next year. And by definition, if you're going to do a partial stack tanking test out at the pad with the core stage and boosters, the core stage need to be completed before then. But we just don't know exactly where that's going to be. This is the first time they're doing final assembly of a core stage in Florida in the vertical. And so there are gives and takes. There are probably some things should go faster because the stage is vertical and you have 360 degree access without having to rotate the stage like you do when it's horizontal. But then this is the first time they're doing it in this tool, in this location. And so we will just see. So I think And then these are similar. I sort of just ran through these, and I've run through those before. I guess I can leave that up. But that's kind of that's generally speaking where things are. And so if you have any, like I said, if you have any questions, go ahead and, at Philip Sloss in chat. Again, Philip with one L, as you can kind of see down here. At Philip Sloss, one word. And I mean, I know I'll try and run through some of these things here. Well, that's going to be, so Yuri was asking a while back about the Starship ConOp now, which is going to be ConOp, concept of operations. Starship, at least for these early lunar landings, and we'll see, we need more definition of that as well. But Starship, the idea would be Orion is launched into Earth orbit, and probably not low Earth orbit to begin with. Then it's not clear whether Orion would find Starship and dock with it, or whether Starship would find who's the chaser spacecraft in this scenario. Since one of the things about going to low lunar orbit is that you're having to very strictly conserve Orion propellant. But the Starship ConOp basically is Earth orbit rendezvous, and then Starship takes everything into low lunar orbit, and then they do the surface mission. They return the crew to Orion, and then Orion flies from low lunar orbit back on a direct return trajectory to Earth. So direct return, a trans-Earth injection burn on a direct re-entry trajectory, re-entry, descent, landing, splashdown in the ocean. For Blue Moon, it's not totally clear but it sounds like for these initial, especially this accelerated architecture, that they're talking about lunar orbit rendezvous and then some kind of staging orbit, whether that would be low. The thing is, if you go lunar orbit rendezvous with Orion under these circumstances, Orion does not have the capability to go from a TLI trajectory to low lunar orbit and then finish again, if we're talking about the low lunar orbit definition I'm using is from Constellation, which Yuri mentioned, which would be 100 kilometers circular. Whether that's what Starship's going to do or not remains to be seen. There is this elliptical polar orbit that NASA evaluated as an alternative when the lunar landing was still Artemis 3, but the orbit itself is still a thing. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, I need to disappear. So this is, the near rectilinear halo orbit is for the now deceased Gateway program. Well, not now deceased Gateway lunar orbital outpost. So the Gateway program lives on as a checking account for the moon base, but the hardware has all been is going to be repurposed or repossessed. And so nobody likes this. Apparently nobody outside of the Gateway, the old Gateway program liked that orbit. And I mean, one of the reasons is because they can't support it. So they can't support NRHO, and it's probably more of a question of the combination of loitering and any lunar staging orbit. It's possible, I think it's probably easier for Starship to support NRHO than it is to support 90-day loiter. And that may also be the case for Blue Moon as well. If Blue Moon is going to be based, even this accelerated architecture is going to be based on cryogenic propellant. So anyway, this is the sort of difference between the two. Instead of 100 kilometers circular, it would be 100 by 6,500 kilometers. The difference between the two is that is an orbit that Orion could support if SLS is going to send it to on a translunar injection. And then as that slide says, you have similar to Artemis 1, you have a multi-burn insertion from that lunar flyby that the TLI burn gives you to some type of lunar orbit. So, and that's going to require some, maybe not several hundreds, but hundreds of meters per second of performance will come out of the Orion system in order to do that. And you only have about a kilometer per second of delta V performance for Orion. So it's doable. The other thing that the EOR does for Starship is no loiter. I would imagine, I think that one of the questions that there are a couple of questions for Artemis 3. We've heard that Starship, I guess, out of the box has a 48-hour loiter capability in just Earth orbit. So that's going to be interesting to see if this might be the first demonstration of that, because obviously if Orion was going to be docked with it for 24 hours or thereabouts, that you're going to need that other 24 hours to support everything else. So maybe they put some additional mission extension hardware in that particular Starship, but I don't know whether that would be an off the line ship or not. But there's that, and then there's also, again, how long can Starship loiter in? Because Starship will have to be refueled first, I believe. Orion only has 21 days of capabilities, and the Starship refueling process will take some amount of time. But I would assume that they would they would want Orion to. You're still going to have this loiter question. It's probably going to be a question of a minimal number of days. And so if, for instance, there was an SLS or an Orion delay on the pad, they might have to do another, just like they have to refuel the storage spheres at the pad. If Orion and SLS are delayed by weather or technical issues, they might have to refuel Starship again and set it up again. So that's why the loiter capability and the loiter constraints are going to be important for Starship. But then also you'd have the same situation with Blue Moon if Blue Moon is going to be based on liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. And in that case, you don't have like that one. If it really is going to be lunar orbit rendezvous, there is going to have to be some level of loiter capability, even if it isn't NRHO. Even if it was low lunar orbit, they're going to need to have some level of loiter capability, and there will probably be some sort of a deadline for SLS and Orion to launch in order to have that mission come off. So it's possible, but there, again, I'm sure there's a trade space there. And it's just going to be something that we're going to have to watch. So I think, like the comment about don't stack them now. There's, the optics are good. And I think the thing that they're thinking, which I've discussed before, the first the Artemis 1 boosters were stacked, again, stacked in air quotes, because the stacking clock doesn't start until the aft center segment is stacked on the aft segment, on the aft assemblies. But for Artemis 1, that period was about 22 months. And so if they were to do that, let's say, let's just call it July 2026. So 22 months would be, 2 months short of 2 years. So we're talking mid-spring of 2028. And so I think they will have had to have seriously considered flying something by spring of 2028 in terms of the next Orion and SLS launch. And again, given the priority that Cadence has taken on in the last half year, that's almost 2 cycles that they're trying to do. They really want to be launching. They want to be launching the 4th SLS vehicle by spring 2028. So if circumstances force them to stay on the ground, they can wait for this 3rd SLS vehicle and 3rd Orion, 3rd full Orion spacecraft. I would imagine that they would. It will be interesting. It would be an interesting. It would be an interesting debate, so to speak, that they would have to have. I think something they really don't want to do. But I just think you have the good optics of starting stacking 3 months after Artemis 2 flies, and you also have a pretty good amount of margin in theory. Again, they don't go hugely into the technical details about what drives those numbers, but they obviously were asked about this for Artemis 2, and they felt confident that they could extend that if they need to. But I think in this situation, they really want to fly something by the end of 2027. And the question, if you get deeper into 2027, so like this time next year, do they consider flying an alternate mission if they can't do these other things? But we may also see, a year is a long time. We've seen how much stuff has happened in the 6 months of this year, not just in terms of Artemis 2, but just in terms of all the policy changes. And so who knows what we could see in the next 12 months. The question about Gateway, I don't know if we have gotten an official word that they have made irreversible changes to the hardware, but I would say they have made irreversible changes, not just for Gateway, but for things like Exploration Upper Stage, Mobile Launcher 2. They may not have made irreversible changes yet, but they've stopped work, and they have made irretrievably irreplaceable changes to the schedules. So Gateway, even if you came in with money, and Gateway wasn't, I don't know if we would be talking about the dates that they were talking about more recently, like 2031 or something like that. But Gateway was tracking to a launch at the end of 2027, which is still a long ways away, and readiness in the 2029. That would be the earliest. So I mean, it was still a long ways away. And then again, similarly for SLS Block 1B, I think that was optimistically end of 2028, early 2029. So what we have, there's stop work, which means that they're not doing any work, which has its own bad, is bad for schedule. But I don't know whether they've destroyed any hardware yet. or made irreversible changes. But we're not seeing anybody politically getting in the way of whether those just maybe that's what happens, is maybe they're just put in storage, and so you could in theory take them out of storage. And we'll see when the power and propulsion element will have to be modified to fly this nuclear propulsion demonstration. So that might be the first thing. It is interesting. I was able to talk with Lanteris Space Systems about the spacecraft last year, and since this change, especially since the cancellation at the end of February, and then some of these other things, they're not responding to questions or inquiries. Yeah, Artemis. So Artemis 5 in 2028 is pretty optimistic, and there's some of these some of these social media posts and other things, and other posts. So we've seen references to the uncrewed. Let me bring up the. Actually, let's probably just do this. Not that, but this. We've seen references to the uncrewed lunar landing demos for both providers are now being referred to in 2028. And so even if they were to fly in, January 1st, New Year's Day 2028, that's pushing Artemis 4 pretty hard to to turn around and then fly a crewed lunar landing demo, and incorporate lessons learned, would be very ambitious. And so if Artemis 4 is sliding farther into 2028, we don't have anything other than the one slightly more specific, no later than March 2028, was in that alternate communication system request for information. So we're not seeing any redefinition. I mean, these schedules and these dates are not. They're a few months old, but that's not very long, especially considering how long it was between delays. Official delays. So I don't know that we're going to get an update on these schedules or when and so for Artemis 5, because they went with the spacer that pushes a lot of the changes to SLS and to the for exploration ground systems out to Artemis 5, and then the schedule is we're basically putting more pressure on Artemis 4, because it just increases the chances that Artemis 4 is going to be the only lunar landing attempt in 2028. There's just not going to be enough time. And so, again, we were just talking about irreversible changes and Mobile Launcher 2. So if you were thinking about using Mobile Launcher 2 as a way of doing things in parallel, well, they were talking about that not being ready to fly the SLS Block 1B vehicle, possibly well into 2028. And so what's happened with that project is that they stopped work, they stopped forward progress, and then they've removed hardware. And so if they were talking about a 2028 readiness before, it seems very unlikely that would be available for use for SLS this decade. So that's not really a possibility either. So it really forces the Centaur 5 option to be ready with Mobile Launcher 1, and the question is how big of a change is. Now, there's another thing. Again, assuming that they can get a 5th core stage built, then you'd basically be forcing Artemis 5 to Starship, I would imagine, and you would force Starship to support taking Orion from low Earth orbit, not just Earth orbit, but low Earth orbit, all the way to low lunar orbit, which was the constellation CONOP. If by the end of 2028 or whenever Starship can support that, then you could in theory go with the spacer, another spacer, again, and basically not fly an upper stage. And then again, that's it's not at all clear that how much the administration, and here I'm talking about the White House. I don't know that the White House's big picture view of SLS has changed. I think they still want it to be, they still want to stop paying for it as soon as possible. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they allow Congress to do some things and keep the pipelines open. But if Starship were ready to do that by the end of 2028, then that also gets them closer to this commercial lunar transportation service. Even though we just heard those remarks to the NSF Flame Trench a few weeks back, that it isn't necessarily soon, but we shall see. I would say that Orion still is required, but how you get it to low Earth orbit is a little bit more of a question. So. The question about objectives and what you get out of a partial stack tanking test, one of the objectives is to validate the fixes that they've been testing for the tail service mast umbilical quick disconnects. So they didn't talk so much. They mentioned that they were working on the liquid oxygen tail service mast umbilical, and those are the umbilicals that connect to the core stage engine section for loading liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. We hadn't heard any issues with leaks on the liquid oxygen side, but they've been talking to some extent, not a lot of details, but they talked about making changes to those umbilicals. And I think the idea would be there'd still be some questions, because one of the factors that they spoke about, but may not be the only one. I've heard some other factors might have come into play in terms of why they had leaks on the hydrogen side for both on the Artemis 1 campaign and on the Artemis 2 campaign. But this will at least give them an initial high fidelity test of that. This would be much closer to the launch configuration than they would get out of the launch equipment test facility. But one of the things that they talked about during February and March, but in particular after the leak in early February on Artemis 2, before the first wet dress, or not before the first wet dress rehearsal, during the first wet dress rehearsal. One of the hypotheses was that the quick disconnects, the seal was compromised. I don't know if compromise is the right word, but there were effects on the seal having it mated for an extended period of time. And so it had been mated, those plates and quick disconnects had been mated, I think it would have been back in May of 2025, and then they weren't tested until very early in February 2026. You won't see that kind of time frame here necessarily if we're to go by the time frames that they're talking about, or make a guesstimate. If let's say that if the core stage was mated in by the end of the summer, for instance, which I think might be optimistic, but we'll see, I guess. And then let's just just to play this out, let's say that the umbilicals are mated in October. You roll out and you do a tanking test before Christmas. So you're only talking about the QDs being mated for a couple of months. So, it would still be interesting to hear the rationale for why, if it's because they would be testing a new design in theory. So I think they're going to say, this is good, but we don't know what they're going to do after they roll back. Would they demate them to look at them? So, there are some questions there, but they would at least get, you're doing sort of a validation of the redesigned quick disconnects or the redesigned umbilical plates. And so you're not just validating that those two hydrogen quick disconnects are sealing correctly, but you're also verifying that everything else is functional, and is leak tight as well. So, but we don't know the scope of the redesign of the umbilical plates or of the quick disconnects either. So but that's one of the things. And then, as I mentioned, they deferred because they wanted to get the mobile launcher back in the vehicle assembly building, because they wanted to stack as soon as possible the next set of boosters. They skipped some of the testing that they'd planned to do before they were going to roll back after Artemis 2. So there's another opportunity there to do that, to do the contingency pad access V&V, verification and validation, when they go out to the pad for this partial stack tanking test. But it's possible, again, depending on how things look at the end of the year or whenever they go out to the pad to do this, with the Orion schedule and so on, or the HLS schedule and so on, that the plans and the content for when they go out to the pad for this first time with the partial stack could be in flux all the way until after they get out there. So, we'll see. I would say, even though big picture, the Blue Origin launch pad is not directly a part of Artemis, it's taken on a bigger importance, and certainly getting that back online has taken on a bigger importance. And so that might end up driving how things go, the timing of Artemis 3 to some extent. But again, that also, we don't know. We don't know how the Mark II assembly is going either. So, but that would be one of the things for the that would be one of the test objectives in terms of going out there and doing this. And so they don't necessarily they have a weather cover, which, they just shipped that to Kennedy Space Center. They have a weather cover for the core stage. I don't know that they have a ready-made weather cover for the launch vehicle stage adapter or the spacer. They have done wet dress rehearsals with the ICPS what's the opposite of derivative? So ICPS is a derivative of the Delta cryogenic second stage, which flew on Delta 4. They did do wet dress rehearsals of Delta 4 vehicles out at Pad 37B with, again, it might have been somewhat of a makeshift weather cover, but it served its purposes. And so, but I don't know that they have anything to cover a spacer or a spacer on top of an LVSA or just an LVSA. They do have some from ground support equipment now that I think of it. I just don't know whether it's a weather cover. So that's one of the reasons why they might go out in that configuration with just the core stage and the boosters. And again, there's no upper stage on this mission, so the core stage is the only stage that they need to do propellant loading on launch day. So let me see if I have. I don't think I can show it. So Yuri's asking about what a trans-Earth injection performance is. What type of performance? Again, these would just be ballparks, but just looking at the constellation, or at least looking at a constellation. Well, so they would, it's possible though that they will have to, because they were talking about, for Constellation, they were talking about a TEI burn that had a delta V of approximately 1,500 meters per second, which is way beyond that. That's not something. Again, that was the Orion for Constellation with the higher performance engine and possibly bigger. I can't remember if the propellant size was as if they had more, but they definitely had more capability with the Orion service module. But again, that doesn't exist. That was just a concept. The current Orion service module, the multi-purpose crew module or crew vehicle version of the service module, exists. And that probably has somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200 meters per second of delta V capability. So it's possible, though, that what they would do, or that they would be forced, isn't necessarily a good way of doing it. But actually, I'm not sure if you can do any kind of a gravity assist from low lunar orbit. So, but it would have to be something that they would take a look at. And it's possible also that the TEI for Constellation might be a shorter transit time, and so there are probably lower performance burns that just take longer to get that take longer to do that, but that would still be okay. But that would be obviously would be interesting to see what they could do. And, because Orion will have to do some station keeping when Starship is down on the lunar surface with the surface crew, at least for Artemis 4. No, so the again, I'm going back here. It's not, if we use these very, very informal conventions of announcing the crew about a year before the scheduled launch date, if Artemis 4 is end of first quarter 2028, then we still have a little bit of time before we reach the end of the first quarter of 2027. That would be Again, informal. I don't think it's stated policy one way or the other, but if you were to accept those as accept the premise of a approximately 12-month training cycle, then they could wait. They could wait till anywhere between January to April of next year before they would want to make that announcement. Now, if they were to do it in that time frame, then they'll be known well ahead of Artemis 3 flying. So it'll be interesting to see how long. It'll just be interesting to see when they choose to make those selections and then and then announce them. So the other question here being about the modifications that are needed for Orion. So for low lunar orbit, they will need, it's not just low lunar orbit per se, but it's also docked burn. So they've talked about this, although they have in very general terms, but it's an issue that we heard talked about. We didn't really get any necessarily get a sense of severity or how big of a deal it was. It was just something that was heard back in the constellation, end of the aughts time frame before everything was canceled. But that in that case, Orion was also taken from low Earth, or was taken from low Earth orbit to low lunar orbit. In that case, it was a two-stage thing, so to speak. So you had the Earth departure stage that did the translunar injection burn, and that was launched with the lunar lander on top. And so Orion docked with those, that mated complex. The Earth departure stage made the TLI burn to send that on a lunar flyby trajectory. Pardon me. And then the lunar lander in that concept of operations did all of the burns necessary to go from, to transfer from a TLI trajectory to low lunar orbit. So, again, in the Apollo days, that was a lunar orbit insertion burn, and then maybe another circ burn. So it could be a 2-burn lunar orbit insertion or a single burn. Again, we don't know what Starship's going to do. But we also don't know where Starship is going to start with Orion, and we don't. But there was the issue there was Orion being docked nose to nose with the lunar lander. You have the same configuration approximately that you would have had for Constellation. So where the crews basically, instead of the crew facing in the direction of travel, they would be facing in the opposite, facing the other way. And so, can you do, it's not just the crew, but if anything more are the systems, are Orion systems and structures and so on, good, so to speak, to fly in that case. And that just, we never heard whether that was resolved, and we had heard, again, a couple of, right before Artemis 2, there were questions about this because they'd already made this announcement, and it was already, I think the Bloomberg story about this came out before Artemis 2 flew. So that question was hanging in the air already. So for Orion to support low lunar orbit, to support the Starship CONOP, I guess it's really to support Earth orbit rendezvous and low lunar orbit, Orion needs to be able to support passively docked burns by the HLS vehicle or the HLS architecture. That could be a cislunar transporter for Blue Origin someday, perhaps, or Starship in this case. And then for low lunar orbit, there are some thermal control questions for Constellation to support 100-kilometer circular lunar orbit, they were talking about needing more than just the radiators, more than just passive thermal control. They were talking about needing additional water cooling. Essentially, they called it a water sublimator. That's not in the European service module implementation at this point. They left, I guess they left a spot for it, and so it could perhaps be added back, but it's not clear whether they need it. This is where you get into these details, which are really important, which is, was that thermal issue for Orion, at what duration was that? Does that become an issue? Is it, a single orbit? Is it, an orbit, a month, a year, or, where does it fall? So since Orion can only support 21 days altogether, if the spacecraft can stay in low lunar orbit for, let's say, a couple of weeks, without a water sublimator kit or without any additional thermal control, then you're fine for Artemis 4 and perhaps several of these early missions. So yeah, I think we didn't get a chance to ask about the thermal control. I'd asked about it before, but again, got a very general answer. But I did get to ask about this. They talked about this -X type of docked burns with Starship. That's something that Lockheed Martin was investigating, and this was again a couple of months ago, right before Artemis 2. So this is like late March. So it was a research topic at that point. I don't know about the thermal control part of it, but those are the types of things. And again, what we heard a month ago, for instance, in the Artemis 3 crew announcement, is they talked about changes that they're going to need to make to Orion, but they didn't go, into any specifics at all. This is, again, this lack of details that we're getting. And just also lack of opportunity to ask questions, unfortunately. So I'm not sure, and that's the thing is we don't know whether the docking systems and the mated docking systems, if that's an issue. We don't. Is it? And what part of it is it? The connection? Is it the structure? Is it the Orion structure? Is it systems? Those are not necessarily certified for those types of loads, but that doesn't necessarily, just because they're not certified doesn't necessarily mean they can't handle it. Like this is again, to go off on a slight tangent. There was a question, or is a big picture question, about Centaur 5. Can it handle SLS launch loads throughout the entire ascent from liftoff through main engine cutoff, and from liftoff through core stage separation? Just because it wasn't designed to handle those doesn't mean that it can. It's just that there's some evidence that it can't as is, that they're going to have to make either changes to Centaur or SLS or both to make that happen. But we don't know, for instance, if there are any issues with Orion, just that it's not certified to deal with those. And so again, we don't know whether the modifications that they're talking about with Orion for Artemis 4 are systems type of modifications, functional modifications, or whether they're structural or not, or what the analysis says at all. So, I mean, there are definitely questions. There's a lot of questions. So it would be interesting to, drill down. That was one of the questions that I submitted to NASA headquarters right after the crew announcement. So unfortunately, during the crew announcement, there was a limited possibilities for media interviews, and so I did not get that. I was not I was one of the many who did not get an opportunity. So I asked if there would be any possibility of getting, of talking to Jeremy Parsons, who's the gentleman who made the presentation on back on June 9th, ahead of the reveal of the crew. But and that was one of the questions that I put in that list, which is, to get a sense of what the scope and details are of those modifications to Orion. Let me see if I mean, I still have them, but I don't know that they basically, but they aren't, they're, again, they're just, it's I guess what I would call selective transparency, which, is what it is. But let's see if, yeah, that was basically, there's that, and then there's also, those were the general questions. What's the scope of the modifications to Orion? Is it structural? What subsystems? And you could call structures a subsystem. What subsystems are they looking at doing? One of the things is that the European service module, when it's delivered from Bremen, Germany by Airbus to Kennedy Space Center, it's, the original idea was that you didn't mess with it. So the radiators are installed. I don't think that they're set up, generally speaking, to remove the radiators to get access to things. So, because it might not be it's possible that the crew module structure, since the crew module is the piece of the, is sort of the piece that made the full transition from the Constellation Orion crew exploration vehicle concept to the, it wasn't called Artemis back at that point. It was just called the Orion Multipurpose Crew Vehicle. But it retained the crew module design and a lot of the designs that went into the crew module adapter, and some of the designs, I guess, that went into the European service module. But I'm not sure about the scope of that. But the point is, it's not clear. It's not clear. And this is one of those topics that's been open for the entire decade. So I've been interested in that water sublimator kit for literally the entire decade. I asked about it before, maybe not before the exact onset of COVID in March 2020, but I was asking about it at that time. And it's just been hard to get. It's again, this is one of those things where these programs, the programs that are fully taxpayer funded are mostly public, I guess, or they're all taxpayer funded, but they're not totally public. They're partially private already. And of course they want to take them fully private, and that with the if they get the full proprietary rights, then it's just like all of these other projects like Starship or Blue Moon or the Axiom EMU. It's proprietary. It's totally up to the product makers how much or how little they talk about what they're doing. So unfortunately, yeah. So it's possible, and unfortunately, this is kind of the way. This is the way we will find out. Unfortunately, is with 100% hindsight. Let's see. So RKR was asking about testing the Starship ECLSS, Environmental Control Life Support Systems. I think one of the things we heard again, sort of euphemistically, very, high level, executive level, talking about Starship. I don't know if it was during the presentations, but there were, again, some media outlets did get interview slots. I think so. The question being, do you see SpaceX doing, like, for instance, a Dragon Starship test, kind of like Artemis 3, except with Dragon? But I think the response that the media got a month ago was that they have all of the experience with the Dragon life support and environmental control systems, which they're going to scale for Starship. And so they feel like that's not, again, I guess my interpretation of what we heard in the responses to those questions from the media that got to ask questions was, pardon me, they feel like they have the Dragon, the experience they have with the Dragon systems probably means they don't need to do anything like that. They don't seem as concerned as with the subsystems, for instance, the lunar subsystems and the landing subsystems that they need to, will be first time systems. So I don't know that they would be, I don't know that they'd be planning to do that, especially when again, I'm not as familiar with the Dragon manifest, but obviously you have the crew rotations to the space station, and then you also have paying. They may have paying customers, and it would be interesting if they really needed to do something like that. Whether they'd be able to bump a paying customer, because I don't know that NASA would pay extra to do that. The HLS option A contract and option B contract is firm fixed price. The price is fixed. The schedule's not fixed, but the price is fixed. So they could negotiate. They could ask NASA if NASA would be willing to pay for that, but NASA would not be obligated to do that like they are with cost plus. Continuing to do that. So I think that basically the general answer is, I think rather than using a Dragon test flight and test docking with Starship, rather than leveraging a test flight, they're just leveraging all of the experience they have with Dragon. And that's acceptable. Probably more than that, at least in their mind. So they don't seem to be. I mean, there's, again, you could either call them lunar systems or surface systems. So things like, we saw the recent OIG report, the elevator, the airlock. I think the elevator was the one that was called out even more. I think in terms of risk reduction, that might be something that that OIG, for instance, or the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, for instance, might want to see a test of a higher fidelity test of that system versus the Eclipse for Starship. I think the question where you have the question is more about an fully integrated spacecraft, because even though you have the subsystems experience, you still need to it still needs to be sized for a Starship system, which is going to have a different, it's going to have a different, the ecosystem is different. You're going to have, you're going to have different, different power sharing, electrical systems, power sharing with other systems and other systems of different sizes and than on Dragon. And then the systems themselves are going to be sized for a larger crew cabin. So that's, so I mean, it would be interesting to see, for instance, how much oxygen, because you have, like, again, I don't know. Well, they did they did these spacewalks from the Dragon crew cabin, but the volume of the Dragon crew cabin versus the Starship airlock, for instance, and just doing like a full depress cycle and a full repress cycle, how much oxygen and nitrogen, depending on what their atmosphere is, they would be required, Starship versus Dragon, and accommodating that, for instance. So there's a lot of that's why I think that would be something that would be an interesting question, which is, there is still, even if there's no technology readiness, like all of the technology readiness levels for all of the systems are high and mature, you still have to put all of them together in a Starship and fly them. And it's not so much of a, again, it's a question of when. It's not so much a question of if they can make that work, it's when they can make that work, and how much time it takes to integrate all of those systems, and how you do an integrated test of something like a Starship. Is it something that they would want to test, on a standalone Earth orbit flight? It wouldn't be Artemis 3, but, would they test, how much will they test the ECLS systems on the uncrewed lunar landing demo? Even though there's not going to be a crew, you still would be able to test the integrated, how those integrate with the Starship system, with all of the other subsystems that will be necessary for a full crewed lunar landing on Artemis 4. So it's I think more of a integration question than a technology readiness question when you're talking about life support systems. Again, that's just my opinion. Timothy's saying the cost of a Dragon launch is much lower than an Orion launch. I think the question is then, if how soon can you have a Dragon? Can you slot a Dragon into the manifest, or do you bump somebody? But if you set aside that issue, then Dragon availability shouldn't be an issue for doing an HLS test, a Starship HLS test, anytime, whenever. And so then the question is, when's a Starship HLS, fully integrated Starship HLS minus the lunar systems, ready to do a test like that? I mean, I think that's the question. So you can put any of these components into a vacuum. And so the question there would be, when could Starship HLS fly an integrated unit like Blue Moon is doing for Artemis 3? Could they do it as soon as the Mark II demonstrator, or will it take longer to do that? So, it's sort of regardless of whether they dock with Orion or with Dragon or with any other crewed spacecraft, although there aren't that many other ones. So the question is more about when the Starship HLS, all of those subsystems, are ready to fly as an integrated spacecraft. So I think let's see, I guess. So if there are any other questions, go ahead and throw those in chat. Just go ahead. The things have settled down. I sort of have caught up, but I guess we can go through a little bit of this again. So some of this recent video. So again, this was the Roman Space Telescope, which arrived on the NASA Pegasus barge. And so that was the primary payload. Secondary payload was the SLS core stage weather cover. So this is, again, this time lapse of this thing. It's a 8.4 meter wide at the base, just like the core stage, and it goes over to the VAB transfer aisle. We already looked at the RS-25 engines, and then we already looked at this. I guess maybe I should go look at the stills then. So that's the old picture of, that's the Artemis 3 Orion service module in May. This was the SLS core stage for Artemis 3 about a month ago. This was a recent ISS crew. But what this indicates is kind of a state of final assembly. So they still have things like the liquid oxygen feed lines that are not installed yet. Those will eventually be needed to do, full leak checks and full checkout of the stage. So, when that's done. But then this is the picture. This was a picture when the weather cover got into the VAB transfer aisle, and I mentioned this in the video. So this is an inert segment that they were using, that the crane and lift teams were using to practice lifts. There's an inert center segment, which is pretty much this. It mimics. There are forward center, and aft center segments, and they all have this same type of, generally speaking, lift handling characteristics. But then also in the background, this is the core stage 4 engine section, which is still sitting out, or was still sitting out in the transfer aisle. And then these were the first two of the 4 Artemis 3 RS-25 engines. So this would be the engine 2052, which got there first, and then this is the second engine. I didn't get the serial number on that one. We have the serial numbers for the engines. We just don't know which. We know 2052 was delivered first. We didn't get the serial number for this one. So we'll just have to wait. But I think, again, as I was saying at the top, it's possible that all 4 of them will be delivered and staged like this in the vertical before they install the first one. Let's see. And then I guess I could go back to. So then this. Well, no, wait a minute. Did I guess I didn't. There were pictures. I guess I have to bring it up this way. There were a couple of pictures that were released. I guess there were 3 at the end of the week of one of the Artemis 3, the other 8 motor segments besides the aft assemblies. I was going to try and. Or maybe there were 4. I guess there were 4. So this is like. Oh, do I have to close this? Or no, I guess I didn't get it. Let me try it one more time. And it's hard to see the forward dome on this, but this is supposedly the left-hand forward segment. So we're looking at it from, this is what it would look like if you were on the mobile launcher umbilical tower facing the boosters and, well, the whole vehicle. And then over here you can kind of see the systems tunnel, and there were a couple of other, this is pictures of it I believe this isn't like I think they call these pedestals, where they do receiving inspections, and then they're eventually put on pallets, and that's what this old video that I queued up was. So this is from September 2020. So this is the same sort of thing of processing segments. There's a good, actually, let's see if I can. But this is kind of the sequence where. let me see if I can go back far enough to get here we go. So, that's taking off the rail car, but so this is the canister for the rail car. I get maybe they don't show the other parts, but this is this same type of stand that they're doing these receiving inspections of, and then it goes on a transportation pallet, which is over here. And so this is what they've been doing. And again, I don't know whether they're doing them all, all the left-hand ones first. And so what you'll see in this time lapse is that eventually you'll see a transporter come in and grab it, pick it up, and take it out of the rotation building. And in this case, they were taken over to the Surge 2 building. But it's not clear if they were going to set aside any of them. I don't know that they need to go that fast. It's also possible. So then here, in this case, this is where we're seeing how they take they're disconnecting the rail cars from that train, and they bring them in one by one. So they've got one of these other segments staged over here on a pallet ready to transport, and they brought in another segment. And this is the same type of sequence that they're going through now. You can see they remove the cover, they break it over. They do a breakover from horizontal to vertical. Actually, maybe this, yeah. So that segment just left. Probably took it over to Surge. They believe they said that they have 2 stands for these other segments, the other 8 segments, and you can actually see over here in the corner is the buildup stands for the aft assemblies. Just barely see those over there, but this is basically what they're going through in the RPSF in the rotation building. It's maybe they've finished it already. That would be pretty quick, but that's what they're trying to do, is to go faster. So I'll go ahead and let's see. So let me go back and now that these are just, let's see. So oh, are you asking about the stage? So that picture of the stage. Yeah, so this is, I wonder if, well, and I probably can't zoom on this one. But this is the inner tank. So this is the inner tank volume. And so there's, you forget, but basically, you have the bottom of the liquid oxygen tank at the top of it, and the top of the liquid hydrogen tank in the bottom. And and then there's a thrust beam that runs basically through the middle in between that space. And there's not a lot of space in there. And, right now they would have a I assume, because I never saw it vertical. I saw the first one in horizontal. I stuck my head in through one of these access doors, and you just see all of this platform. It was really hard to see much of anything, because there's, people are crawling around in there doing work. But you can sort of see here. So again, this is one of the access doors. There's another one on the other side of the vehicle. And this is actually the side that faces out towards the public, so to speak. And you can kind of see here. So, and the plastic is, again, they have electronics, and they have propellant lines, and they have other, equipment in there that they're trying to keep air conditioned, essentially. And so, there's a lot of equipment that doesn't like the heavy moisture that you get in Florida for most of the year. And so that's probably what they're doing is you probably can't see it here very well, but there's a purge or multiple purges that are in this volume, in the forward skirt volume up on the top, and then the engine section volume down at the bottom. And you can sort of see you can see this circle in here is where that, again, I was talking about those S ducts. So the feed lines are multi-segment. They're bolted, they have bolted flanges on either end. So the first segment of that, I believe, is a single segment. They're called S ducts because they connect to the sump at the bottom of the liquid oxygen tank. There are two connections that start the feed lines. Those then run from the sump through the space that there is, and they come out here and then there's another 90-degree turn. There's a segment that connects to this, and then there are straight segments that go all the way down the length of the liquid hydrogen tank, and then there's another S segment that's already been integrated into the engine section, and then you've got the two over a foot diameter main feed lines from the liquid oxygen tank. And then when they go into the engine section, similarly to shuttle, you had in the case of the external tank, you had a single feed line from the liquid oxygen tank, and then that branched to 3 engines. In this case, with the core stage, you have 2 feed lines which branch to a pair each. So they're still feed lines, I guess, but then you go from plus Z feed line and a minus Z feed line for the main ones on the outside of the tank. And then when you get into the engine section, then they branch to, engine 1, engine 2, engine 3, engine 4 feed lines. And then those go basically directly to the low pressure fuel or oxidizer turbopumps / inlets for each of the 4RS-25 engines. So no, what it sounds like is that so the question is the Artemis 3 crew going to pilot all 3 vehicles? No. So they will, I'm sure, they will do some piloting, I would imagine. It probably won't be as extensive as the manual piloting demonstrations that were done on Artemis 2, but the Orion flight control system now they're developing, finishing development of fully autonomous rendezvous and docking. And so that's officially rendezvous, proximity operations, and docking. So they want to test that the autonomous system works. So in terms of the docking part of it, they probably won't be flying Orion that much. And of course, Orion still had an autopilot on Artemis 1 and Artemis 2, but they're now adding docking capabilities as well. But the crew will I would imagine, do some manual piloting of Orion. I don't think they're going to fly. The Blue spacecraft, but they aren't going to. But they are supposed to, or the great desire is to ingress this Mark II demonstrator. I was going to ask if it's a full-scale Mark II crew cabin because they didn't say, and we don't really have a good idea about the dimensions of this spacecraft, which is important because of the availability of New Glenn is now somewhat in question, at least the timing of it. But setting that aside, they're going to ingress. They may do, systems management or just, essentially doing some systems monitoring practice for the Blue systems. Not clear how high a fidelity those crew displays or crew interfaces will be, but I assume that there will be something like that. So it's a little bit different than flying the spacecraft. I don't know whether they're going to want to test, because this Mark II demonstrator spacecraft is not. I don't know that it represents something that you would fly while you're docked to Orion. And I don't know whether that would be something that they would want to do, but I know that they talked about some test objectives in terms of controllability of these mated stacks. So Orion to Blue Moon. So it's possible that they will they'll do some testing of that. So I guess it's not out of the question, but it's also possible that they don't fly Blue Moon, and it would only again be while docked. And then Starship, they're not talking about the Starship that they're talking about for Artemis 3 is not an HLS spacecraft. So they can't even go on board that spacecraft. The idea is to test the controllability. Again, I don't think they're talking necessarily about attitude control. Starship should be capable of, of attitude control with something like Orion on the nose. It's more about compatibility, really, of Orion to be able to handle a long translational burn by the Raptor engines on the Starship, which they will need to do for Artemis 4. So JC was asking a little earlier about what they might manifest on Pegasus. I think this is one of the first, or perhaps the first, non-SLS payload on Pegasus since it was extended for SLS. So I remember seeing it at Stennis in, I believe it was 2015, parked in the docks, parked so to speak, but in the docks there at Stennis, after it had been extended post shuttle in order to carry the core stage. And since then, it's mostly been, if not completely, SLS hardware. So it's been transporting ground support equipment, core stages, other, So ground support equipment, core stages from New Orleans to Huntsville, and from New Orleans, between Huntsville, New Orleans, and Kennedy Space Center. And so they'll mix and match. So it just depends. So I think when there's a core stage on board, there's not a lot of room for too much of anything else other than the carriers that the stage is on itself. But then when they transport things like, the launch vehicle stage adapter, which is at Huntsville, they will I can't remember if they did this for the first one, but for the last one they went and picked up the Artemis 2 LVSA, and then because they positioned it at the back of the barge, and then they came back and picked up those two core stage engine section elements. So the boat tail for the Artemis 3 engine section, and then the barrel, the full engine section structure for core stage 4. This is back end of the summer of 2024. So that's the kind of stuff that they'll mix and match. Trying to remember when they left this last time, they took back the GSE, so the transportation stand for one of the launch vehicle stage adapters, the one that they brought that Artemis 2 adapter for. So they have at least two of those stands, and so the LVSA for Artemis 3 is sitting on that in storage right now in Huntsville. But now, in theory, you're going to need to build another LVSA, and you might want to get started on that if you need that by, probably not this time next year, but you would in theory need it by the end of 2027 if you're really going to try and fly Artemis 4 by the end of the first quarter of 2028. So that's kind of the kind of things I'm trying to remember what other things that they put that one, and I think they put something else on there. But the point of the trip was to the primary reason was for the Roman Space Telescope. So since the barge typically is stationed in New Orleans at the dock there, they figured out what they could take. So like one of the pieces of hardware that we would in theory be that I've been wondering about is the boat tail for the core stage 4 engine section, which I can't remember if they said it was done. I'll have to go back to my notes from April, but they were looking for a good time to do that. So, again, we'll see what happens with the Artemis 4. The Artemis 4 date is still very vague, so we'll have to see how that goes. So Joe is asking about the if Artemis had a steady architecture. I mean, I guess that SLS was, I think by the time the Artemis branding came into play in spring of 2019, there was a more realistic assessment of the SLS capabilities. So before that, so like a decade ago, middle of the last decade, they were projecting that you would get to a flight rate of twice a year, and basically as you're saying, I've lost it. There it is. Where you would fly one cargo SLS and one crew SLS every year. Like they were trying to reach that around this time, 26, 27. Again, that's, you have to think about what that looks like now is what 2036 and 2037 look like today. So, of course, within, certainly in 2018, but certainly by the end of 2018, there was again a very famous isn't the right word, but a well-known OIG report that came out in October of 2018 that was talking about the slips. And I think at that point, that's probably the point where plans changed completely from where SLS was, they were talking about a cargo SLS. They were talking about, again, higher flight rates, and very quickly transitioned to it's, basically just going to be what it would be at this point, unless Boeing and Northrop Grumman really want to take on the financial burden of operating it on their own. But at this point, it's basically just an Orion launch vehicle. It will launch Orion to the moon, a couple of more times. Well, obviously not on Artemis 3, but it's possible that it could only be once or twice more. And so whether it's launching Orion and it's an Orion and a lunar capable of upper stage, whether they use the upper stage for that is also a question. But a couple more, whether it's stops at Artemis 5 or there's whatever happens to it, it became an Orion launch vehicle somewhere around the beginning of this decade. Probably maybe not officially because there's the politics that are involved, but that was the idea a decade ago. There's manifests again with this original gateway concept, where it was called a deep space gateway, and then they would build something else that you could launch on a single cargo SLS, and then stage it out in the gateway orbit. And then it would disconnect from the gateway, and this was the old deep space transport concept. And then you could do, again, no landings on Mars, but you could perhaps do these inner solar system tours or things like that. Again, under those circumstances where they didn't have a lunar lander and they were kind of looking for missions to do with a rocket and a lunar capable spacecraft. So I don't think so. Yuri was asking. I mean, we don't. All we have is that sentence from Jessica Jensen of taking a ship off the line. Whether they it's and to be fair, it's possible that they're going to, if not probable, that they're just going to continue, evaluate this periodically to see what else they might be able to add, or whether they'll just stick to a quote unquote off the line version 3 ship. But that should be something that's perhaps a minimal capability that they can support a year from now, with a docking adapter on the nose, I would assume. So no, the EVA, a prototype EVA suit. The plan would be, again, based on what we heard a month ago, the plan would be to fly a prototype, maybe like an engineering prototype of the EVA suit, but it would not be a functioning. It would be the form and fit of the suit, but it would not be a functional suit. And again, the idea would be to fly it on the Blue Moon spacecraft, and then the crew goes into the Blue Moon spacecraft, and if they have time, they would practice getting into the suit in some sort of a, maybe not a high fidelity airlock, but something that had, maybe a medium fidelity airlock, but something where they could practice putting on and taking off the suit, and perhaps multiple crew members doing that if they have time to do that. So that's really all they're talking about doing on Artemis 3. But then also in 2027, what they've talked about doing is taking a functional suit, flying that to the space station, the ISS, and then doing a functional test of the suit. And that would presumably be an extravehicular activity where you take the suit out, you go through the whole donning the suit, getting it ready to go outside, hooking it up to the, having it hooked up to the umbilicals, having everything charged to go outside and topped off. And then you disconnect from the umbilicals, you depress, disconnect from the umbilicals, go out for some period of time, do some evaluations with the suit at vacuum, and then come back in. And so that would be it wouldn't mimic being on the lunar surface exactly, but it would be a test at vacuum, and they are evaluating that suit as a replacement suit for the old shuttle extravehicular mobility unit, which is still the suit that the USOS uses on ISS. So, I would imagine that it would serve both purposes in the long run, but and then the question being, you could certainly postulate the question, which one of those ends up being a higher priority depending on what other issues are going on at the time. And of course that all remains to be seen, whether they have the critical design review that they need to get done before that, I would assume. And then will they have a suit ready to go in 2027 for the ISS flight? That also remains to be seen. Yeah, I think that is the you guys are talking about different delta V numbers, and there are different of these graphics. I guess I could, so this is the old, again, this graphic was in support of Gateway, so take it, grain of salt, but the math should still be approximately the same. But again, I know I was reading a paper by Dr. Griffin, and again, Dr. Mike Griffin, the previous NASA administrator, he still thinks they should do an SLS architecture. But there's this whole factional thing of sometimes you can be I don't know about objectively skeptical, but it's easier to evaluate the other side's work than it is to apply the same standards to yours. But setting that aside, let me see if I can pull up that graphic. But yeah, I think they were talking about a little bit over 3,000 meters per second to go TLI from that sort of reference parking orbit. The reference parking orbit that they were talking about, like, again, this idea of flying Orion on Falcon Heavy for Artemis 1 back in the day. Let me see if... and actually, I'm actually running out of time. But I'll put this up here and then let me do this. Let me put it up and then, well, there's a couple of them. Let me see if, yeah, this is an old Gateway slide too, but like I said, the numbers should still be the numbers for the most part, but there are others. But yeah, the reference parking orbit that they were talking about back in 2019 when they did this sort of quick and dirty study, when the Launch Services Program did this quick and dirty study, again, my words, quick and dirty study, but I think they only spent maybe a month on it, was 185 kilometers, which is roughly 100 nautical miles. But so 185 kilometers circular TLI burn would be approximately 3,200 meters per second, something like that. So but yeah, so for either of the landers, they're going to have to go from where they may not be dropped off in a 185 kilometer parking orbit. It's possible, again, like with the refueling, it's going to be something else. It could be still be a low Earth orbit, but it could be 400 kilometers, or again, you have to be careful about. Well, you have to be careful about whatever you want to be careful about. So, for instance, like when they're talking about the Artemis 3 circular orbit, they're trying to stay below where the main micrometeoroid debris cloud is, which is, I think they said they wanted to stay below 250 nautical miles. So maybe, again, I don't know where SpaceX wants to put their LEO depots. But yeah, it's not, and we don't know what end of mission is for Starship HLS for Artemis 4, whether it would be, surface to low lunar orbit. They are quoting here 0.9. So this is they're quoting approximately 900 meters per second from low lunar orbit to Earth. And again, that would be direct entry. So direct return, as opposed to low lunar orbit to LEO, for instance, or trans Earth, I guess you would have, but it would be, so 900 meters per second versus, for instance, if you were to go, you're talking about probably on the order of more than 3 kilometers per second to go from the moon back into Earth orbit. So yeah, there's a lot of different, there's a lot of different capabilities here. So I think eventually, obviously Starship is supposed to be a fully reusable system at some point. They're not going to want to throw away ships after a while, certainly. So I would assume that they're either going to extend their supply chains out to the moon, or they're going to go, do in situ, refuel on the surface. That's another way to do it, but that's not going to be available at the beginning. That in fact, that probably is what they want to do. I would imagine is to refuel on the surface. I think, again, you can see that philosophy. NASA has adopted that same philosophy of, they want to stage everything on the surface and worry about the other stuff later. The logistics, that's the preference, is to stage things on the surface rather than in a particular staging orbit. So I guess I'll go ahead and leave that slide up. That'll probably be we can stop here for now. And it's going to be a while. I'll probably do a public live stream approximately every month. This made sense because it was Independence Day weekend here in the States, relatively slow news week. But I'll go ahead and, so there will be time. I think, the rest of the year, we're going to be obviously watching Launch Complex 36 at Cape Canaveral to see how quickly that comes back to life. And watching Artemis 3, some of the Artemis 3 preparations. Hopefully we will get something. We'll be obviously watching Starship flight testing. Hopefully we'll see it go orbital here relatively soon. And then looking forward to the Artemis tech demos, again, hopefully by the end of the year. So, but there will be, there should be time to do another one of these, either end of this month or beginning of August and so on. So, and yeah, the World Cup, the knockout round has been, knockout stage has been very entertaining. And yes, I'm probably interrupting a match, so to speak. I'm certainly being outdrawn for sure. I'll let you guys go and watch the rest as well, or concentrate specifically on that. But yeah, thanks again for everybody's time. If you have a chance, like the live stream, that helps me out. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks again.